Well, look at that. It's Friday. It's the best day of the week. It's the best day of the week because it's Friday, and everybody loves a Friday, right? But it's also the best day of the week because, it's the Morning Pitt Mailbag. My favorite day of the week, my favorite Morning Pitt episode to record every week, although I think we've had some interesting topics this week, certainly talking about Jalen Lowe, transfer portal moves, the latest from spring camp. The conversation yesterday about the GM, which, kind of led to me asking Panther-Lair a question about hiring a GM yesterday after Pitt's practice, and that led to an interesting exchange where he said they already have a GM, even though it was later clarified that that GM doesn't actually work for Pitt. But that's another conversation for another time. Maybe we'll talk about it on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com or on a future episode of the Morning Pitt. I don't know if we'll get into it today on the mailbag, but to me, it's a very interesting topic because of where this sport, where college sports really is going in the next 3 months, and then the great beyond after that. But you know what we do here on Friday? We take all the questions on the Morning Pitt mailbag throughout the week. Pitt fans on Panther-Lair.com will post their questions on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board, and we answer as many as we can right here on the Morning Pitt mailbag, the Friday episode of the Morning Pitt. So I always look forward to. We've got some great questions this week about defensive ends, an interesting stat category topic that I think I'm looking forward to digging into, because some of these, I look at the questions ahead of time and I sort of formulate an answer in my mind. I'm like, I think I'm probably going to say this, or I'll say that, or I'll talk about this, or I'll talk about that. And then some I look at and I say, that's going to be interesting. Let's wing it and see what we come up with on the fly. And that's going to be the case with at least a few of these questions. So no more preamble, no reason for this. I really put the ramble and preamble. Let's dive right into it. It's the Morning Pitt Mailbag here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Wait a second. There's no ramble and preamble. What am I talking about? There's a reamble, but there's no ramble. Anyway, I just put the ramble and preamble. You need to like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We had a little situation on Wednesday night with our live show where we started late due to a few different reasons. I got held up and delayed. We weren't really sure what time we were going to start. But as we found out, if you subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, you turn on the notifications, you can get an alert sent to your phone whenever we go live. So, it's Wednesday night. It's 8:30. I don't know what time the live Panther-Lair show is going to start. Oh, look, I got a notification. They're going live now. I need to tune in to jump into it. So there's a practical application. It's not just for my vanity to see those subscriber numbers go up. It's an actual practical reason for you to subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and that's so that you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. So like this video, subscribe, you'll be locked in, and then check out the website Panther-Lair.com. It's where all the questions for the mailbag come from, and let's dive into it now on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board at Panther-Lair.com. And the first question comes from Big Husky 34. Says, I haven't heard really any buzz about the defensive ends that were brought in. What are you hearing on the three newcomers, and who will start alongside Jimmy Scott? Last year, we heard early the Clemson defensive end was a dud, which turned out to be true from the spring report. So it's funny, Big Husky 34. I typically don't. I don't really look at the questions too much ahead of when we actually record the mailbag. I'll open it up a little bit earlier in the day, maybe 20 minutes before I'm going to sit down and record the mailbag, just in case there's anything I want to look up statistically or any kind of research I want to do to answer a question. And sometimes I do that and sometimes I don't. But I don't really open the questions earlier in the week. And so it's funny that you asked this because I'm recording this on Thursday, and literally a few hours before I sat down to record this, I was sitting in the press conference room, the team meeting room in the South Side, and asked Panther-Lair specifically about the defensive ends, about how the newcomers have done and how that position group is shaping up and how much of a priority it was this offseason. So good on you for coming up with this question, and good on you and I both for thinking about the same thing. And so it kind of put us in a good spot. As far as these new defensive ends, the first thing Panther-Lair mentioned was Jaden Moore. He's the youngest guy, the one coming in from Oregon. He's a redshirt freshman, redshirt sophomore, I think. I think he might be a redshirt sophomore. Maybe has the highest ceiling out of any of the transfers. Any of the transfer defensive ends, and maybe most of the guys on the roster. Had a really productive year at Oregon last year in terms of pressures and pressures per snap. He didn't play a ton. He played a decent amount. He played enough to put up some numbers, but his pressure rate and pass rush win rate. Don't tell the Steelers reporters that I mentioned that. But it ranked him, it was some of the best, sort of pound for pound in terms of limited snaps. It was some of the best in the Big Ten last year. So he was really productive. He was really good, showed a lot of potential. And I think he's going to move into a top 4 role at worst this year. I think you really look, like you said, you've got Jimmy Scott back, and you have these 3 transfers coming in, Jaden Moore and Blaine Spires and Joey Zielinski. And I think that'll make up your top 4 on the field. I really do. I think that's going to be the 2 deep. I mean, you've got Nate Temple kicking around out there. Pat Narduzzi said he's still not really 100%. You've got Maverick Grazio, who made that big play in the West Virginia game, blocking the punt. And I think he might have even gotten hurt on that play or later in the game. Or at some point he got hurt and, had to miss most of the season. You got like Zach Crothers. You've got true freshmen coming in. And there's some intriguing guys, certainly among the true freshmen. But ultimately, I think you're going to be looking at those 4 guys, Jimmy Scott and the 3 transfers, to fill out your 2 deep. And I'm somewhat bullish on that group. I mean, I think you're right. David Ojebwe didn't really get rave reviews. He looked like $1 million, but he wasn't really all that productive in practice and certainly not in games. That's why he didn't really get many reps in the games. Whereas, we're hearing pretty good things about Jaden Moore. Pat Narduzzi said yesterday, Joey Zielinski's doing a nice job. He said Blaine Spires has been a little bit banged up, so they've tried to be smart and be a little cautious with him, not overdo it in terms of his usage, and certainly not in the live contact. But I've heard a lot of, that's what Narduzzi said yesterday, but I have heard from some different people, some pretty positive reviews of how Blaine Spires has looked overall so far. So, man, if you're comparing, defensive ends last year to this year, and actually there's another question that's coming up about this, so I don't want to overdo it on this topic just at this, in this exact moment. But if you're comparing last year to this year, where last year you're looking at Jimmy Scott and Nate Matlack with Sincere Edwards and who else played, like Chief Borders, I think the group should be better. You know what I mean? I think Scott, Spires, Zielinski, and Moore should be better than Scott, Matlack, Edwards, and Borders. Because that was basically your unless I'm forgetting someone, that was your top. That was your top 4 rotation. And Sincere Edwards, I think, has a lot of potential. I think he's going to be a really good player. I think he had flashed some real, he had some real flashes last year, but he was also a true freshman. So, I mean, there was a limit to how much you really expected out of him in his first year. All of these guys have experience. They've played before. Spires has played a lot. Zielinski's played a lot. Jimmy Scott has a decent amount of experience. And Moore, being the youngest guy, has, he's played. He's been out there. You're not really breaking in a true freshman in this rotation as long as those top 4 stay healthy. So, I think it looks like that position group should improve. How much they improve and whether they become, what Pitt ultimately needs, which is an impact position group or not, remains to be seen. But I do think they look like they'll be better than they were a year ago. I think they'll be improved from how they played last season, which would be huge because that was the biggest missing piece, right, with the defense was the pass rush and the lack of productivity out of the defensive ends. I mean, Jimmy Scott led the team. Did he lead the team? I know he had 6 sacks. I know he led the defensive ends with 6 sacks. No, Kyle Lewis had 7 sacks. Rasheem Biles also had 6. So, Jimmy Scott tied for second in sacks. Nate Matlack down in 4th, really, if you figure that 3 guys had more sacks than he did. But, I went from you'd like to you want to you need your defensive ends to be the most productive players when it comes to getting sacks. In this defense, the way they play, I know they're aggressive, they like to blitz, but you need the defensive ends to be getting that production. And last year they didn't. That's got to change this year. I think they should be better than they were a year ago. It's just a question of how good they're going to be, and that I don't really know the answer to that one yet. That one we're going to have to probably wait until the season gets started to really get a clear picture of. And so the next question, Smenges, this actually ties in with some of the other things we're talking about, specifically with the defensive ends. Smenges says, at which position groups do you expect Pitt to be improved statistically over last season? Defensive ends, defensive tackles, quarterbacks, linebackers, receivers, tight ends, running backs. I do think the defensive ends will produce more. I think they'll be more productive than they were a year ago. Defensive tackles, what was their production? I mean, Sean Fitzsimmons had 4.5 tackles for loss and 1.5 sacks. who else? Isaiah Neal had 3 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. Nick James had 2 tackles for loss, no sacks. Francis Brew had 3 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks. Nakai Johnson had 1 tackle for loss. Elliot Donald had 0.5 tackles for loss. There wasn't a lot in terms of production out of the defensive tackle position. And that's always going to be one of those tough positions to produce. It's not necessarily a big stat-producing position unless you have one of those exceptional guys, Kalijah Cansey, Aaron Donald, Mick Williams, Jalen Twyman types, right? I do think this can be a really good group of defensive tackles. I think, with Nick James, Sean Fitzsimmons, Isaiah Neal, Francis Brew, and Jasir Whittington, like that's a loaded group. I really think so, and I really think they can improve on the production from last year and maybe even be like a strength of the team. I mean, I think they're really talented players, and Whittington and Brew as second-year players, Isaiah Neal in his third year now, Fitzsimmons and James have been around for a while. Like these guys, these are talented players with experience. I think you should expect more production out of the defensive ends and the defensive tackles. What other positions did you mention? Quarterbacks, what can you say about quarterbacks? They had Eli Holstein had played half the season. Eli Holstein should put up better stats than he did a year ago. The position group as a whole probably should be better, more yards, more touchdowns, and all of that. You would assume if there's more continuity and consistency on the offense, with personnel-wise, play calling, and all that stuff, you would expect them to be better. And if they are better, then the receivers and tight ends should put up better numbers. Running backs, we'll see. It depends a lot on kind of how the rest of the offense is working. And linebackers, I think Biles and Lewis are really, really good, but those guys last year combined for 30 tackles for loss and 13 sacks, 5 interceptions, and 2 forced fumbles. Like they might. Oh, and they also had 183 tackles combined in 25 games. Biles didn't play all 13. So those guys could have really good seasons again and either only match or fall short of the numbers they put up a year ago and still have great seasons. Like if Kyle Lewis has 6.5 sacks instead of 7 or 15 tackles for loss instead of 15.5, his production won't go up. The linebacker production won't go up, but he could be just as good, if not better than he was in 2024. So my guess is they'll put up better numbers, but I don't know. They already performed at such a high level. Maybe Braylon Lovelace can improve some of the numbers that Brandon George put up. Brandon George had 5.5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks. Last year, Lovelace had 10.5 tackles for loss and 4 sacks. But Lovelace was also playing a lot on the outside. So, is middle linebacker going to get as many opportunities for those tackles for loss and sacks? Maybe not. But potentially the numbers could come up there a little bit. So maybe the linebackers have better production. But I think the focus is on the front four. The focus is on the defensive ends and the defensive tackles producing at a higher level than they did in 2024. And I think they will. I think they should. I think they are more talented this year than they were a year ago. But and obviously, and Pitt needs them to produce at a higher level. I forgot where I was going with that. But I think they will. I think they're more talented. I think Pitt needs more out of them. I think the defense is designed for those guys to make plays, and I think they will. I'm sort of bullish on that group. Bullish on everybody. It's spring camp. Everybody's a champion in spring camp, right? Everybody's a national champ in spring camp. You don't really learn all that much about your team, but you feel pretty good about it, or at least you should. Del Sardo One-Handed says, given the recent reports of the quarterbacks and taking injury out of the equation, if you had to put a percentage chance on another quarterback besides Eli Holstein starting a game this year, what would you say? 0%, 5%, 10%? Taking injury out of the equation, probably only 5% right now. Look, there have been a lot of positive reviews of Julian Duggar and Mason Heinchel. I think those guys are playing well this spring. I think Duggar showed that potential in the bowl game and has continued it over into spring camp. I think Heinchel has really impressed people as a true freshman. He's picked up the offense well and he's running it well. Those guys both had some big plays, from what we've heard, had some big plays in the scrimmage last Saturday. And so, the arrow's pointing up on Duggar and Heinchel, whereas maybe Holstein's not having as good a spring as you would hope. but I still think he's your QB1. I still think he's your starting quarterback. I still think it's going to take, more significant events in August than what we're seeing in March and April to unseat him. Now, I know enough to never say never, so I'm going to put it at 5%. You gave the options of 0%, 5%, 10%. I won't go as high as 10% just because it's sort of, if I take your highest number, right, I say it's the highest number, it sort of sounds like I would go higher if I could. Like if you said 20%, I would take that. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go right in the middle and say 5%. I think the possibility exists. I think the chances of it happening are slim. And I think, Eli Holstein will be the guy, but I can't entirely rule it out. You can never say never. Jay Leisinger says, what in the world are we going to do with this basketball team? We're really leaning on a Cummings jump. Yeah, I mean, right now he's your basically your top returning guy, certainly your top returning guard, and probably he's your top returning player, I would say, even though Cam Corrin averaged more points per game. Look, they are going to be counting on Brandon Cummings to take a big jump next season. But even if Jalen Lowe was coming back, they would be counting on that. Even if the Twins were coming back and Amsal was coming back, they would be counting on Brandon Cummings taking a big jump into his sophomore season. That's part, just like last year, they were counting on Jalen Lowe taking a big jump going into his sophomore season. None of the transfers change what the expectations are for Brandon Cummings. They were expecting him to be a big piece of the team for next year, and that continues to be the case. What it's all going to come down to is the pieces that they put in around Brandon Cummings. If they're able to find good guards, good wings, good post players, they need everything, right? Like I don't even need to say, well, if they can find a good player for this position or that position, they need somebody at every position. And so that's what's going to determine the season is who they add around Cummings. Do they get more 3-point shooting? Do they get some kind of a post presence, which they might? I like that might be a priority, or it might be important. I mean, like they have needs at every spot, 1 through 5, and the bench. So, and that how they address those needs is ultimately what's going to decide or determine how this how the team looks for next season. So this question. This question, Atwood409, rank these hires from best to worst. Jeff Capel, Kevin Stallings, Mike Haywood, Todd Graham, Heather Lyke, Steve Peterson 2.0. Pitt MBA, for his part, or their part, chimes in and says best to worst. Peterson, Lyke, Capel, Graham, Stallings, Haywood. Interesting. I think the only problem is, I can't entirely agree with Pitt MBA's rationale there because they're using Steve Peterson, including the Walt Harris, Ben Howland, Jamie Dixon hires, and that wouldn't have been Peterson 2.0. I think with this question, best to worst, Capel, Stallings, Haywood, Graham, Lyke, and Peterson 2.0, I'm going to look at it. I'm going to choose to answer it a certain way. I'm not going to look at it based on the results or the outcome. And I know you say, well, why? I mean, yeah, you should, right? And in that regard, like based on the results and the outcome, like Mike Haywood was the worst out of all of those. The guy made it like 2 weeks before he got arrested. Like no matter what you want to say about Heather Lyke or Todd Graham, at least Todd Graham stuck around for 10 months, or 11 months or whatever it was. Mike Haywood barely made it 2 weeks. So before he got arrested, it's not even like he left for another job. Like the dude had to leave his position. He was fired because he got arrested. So he goes down as the worst. And whatever you want to say about Capel, whatever you want to say about Stallings or Graham or Lyke or Peterson or anybody, like Mike Haywood would go the worst based on results and outcomes. In terms of the quality of the hire, based on how the hire process went, who they hired, what their resume looked like the hire itself, how it looked at the time, not just how it was perceived by the fan base, but how it looked at the time. The reality is, Capel's the best hire out of all of them. It is. Because even if you want to talk about Heather Lyke, I think there was a lot of good pub and press when Heather Lyke was hired, but there was also a certain reality about her time at Eastern Michigan and how it ended and how Eastern Michigan was sort of in debt for crazy capital spending spree, and there was a sport. I think they had canceled a sport or eliminated a sport, and there were Title IX lawsuits and things like this. And this is what she walked away from to come to Pitt. And so while we were all trying to figure out how to, why it made sense for Pitt, and I think there were reasons why it maybe did, there were also some question marks about her process and how she had actually done at Eastern Michigan. Todd Graham was a good hire at the time. It worked out to be a disaster, but it was a good hire at the time. Kevin Stallings was a bad hire. Mike Haywood was a uninspiring hire. He had won the MAC. And so that was, I guess held up as his big accomplishment. And, but I don't think anybody was really moved by that. Peterson didn't get a lot of, there wasn't a lot of excitement about Steve Peterson getting hired. But they won the 13-9 game like that day or the next day or something. Maybe he was hired on Friday and they won 13-9, the West Virginia game the next day. So it kind of, it was a good time for Pitt fans, but I don't know if there was a lot of excitement about him being hired back. Jeff Capel had the most hype of anybody who was hired. Like in terms of the hiring process, the resume, the reception upon being hired, best to worst, Capel was number 1. Todd Graham was number 2. I guess would be 3, Haywood 4, Peterson 5, and Stallings 6. I think the Stallings hire was hated even more than the Peterson hire the second time. It really was. Nobody liked that hire. Now, in terms of outcomes and results, Mike Haywood is last. I have to work up from the bottom because you've given me some tough options here. In terms of the outcome and how it went down, Mike Haywood is last in terms of being the worst hire out of this group. Stallings is down there. I mean, the dude went 0-18. Like, whatever you want to say about Jeff Capel and how he's done, Capel made it to the tournament. He won some tournament games, and he hasn't gone 0-18 in the ACC. He hasn't had a completely winless ACC performance yet. So, Haywood's last. Stallings. Peterson, he was here when they got into the ACC, opened the Peterson Sports Complex. That was I guess that was better. But, he hired Graham. He hired Paul Christ. He hired Haywood. Heather Lyke has Victory Heights. A lot of head coaches who have been fired. Steve Peterson hired Dan Fisher. So, okay, here we go. Mike Haywood's the worst, in terms of outcomes. Ranking these hires, Haywood is the worst. Stallings is the second worst. Oh God, what about Todd Graham? All right. This is good. This is good radio. Haywood's the worst. Stallings, Graham, Peterson, Capel. Best to worst, Capel, Peterson, Graham, Stallings, Haywood. That's actually pretty close to what Pitt MBA said. He said Peterson, Capel, Graham, Stallings, Haywood. I went Capel. Where did I go? Capel, Peterson, Graham, Stallings, Haywood. So that's my list. Share your list. What do you think? Best to worst out of those hires? It's not a fun conversation, but it's kind of funny and sort of a dark humor kind of way. But enjoy your Friday because that's a fun topic to discuss. But yeah, let me hear in the comments here on YouTube or on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com what you think. How you would rank those hires. If you want to see the list, it's in the thread on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board. You can find it there. You can scroll through and see the list of names and decide how you would rank them best to worst. And like I say, you can post it on the message boards, or you can post it in the comments here on YouTube, or send a tweet, email it to me, whatever you want to do. You can, you can let me know what you what you think. Anyway, make sure you like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I think we've spent enough time on this one already. It's time to jump into the weekend. So thanks for watching the video. Thanks for hanging out today. Hope you've had a great week. Hope you enjoy your weekend. And we will catch up with you on Monday for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.